Hello, my beautiful mates. Captain Mitch here. So, today I am coming to you with this video and this piece that I thought I would never do. I genuinely do not know what came over me. I think it was one of those moments where I realized wait, I can draw everything, which means I can draw everything. So I decided to create a painting of Budi inspired by this image on social media with Budi painted in the style of like an old time monarch painting. And I thought this is absolutely amazing. I love Budi. He's like such a cultural icon. Let me enlarge this intellectual property pool. In terms of the process behind creating this illustration, it was rather straightforward. I used a painting of Napoleon. It's pretty famous. I'm gonna put it on screen in case you don't know what I'm talking about, but it's this iconic painting of Napoleon on a horse, and I think it's heralded as one of those historical moments of power because of the pose, the lighting, and obviously the historical character that is depicted, Napoleon. And I think the most challenging part of actually drawing up this idea was that I went into it completely blind. I really went into it just for the laughs and to figure out what I could do, so there was literally no thumbnailing behind this. It was pen on paper and just me figuring out how in the world am I going to make a baby orangutan sitting on a horse, which is, by the way, very difficult. Obviously, orangutans don't usually sit in these poses, so I had to be very creative with my entire process. Regardless, after I managed to do the sketch and clean up the line art, I jumped into the painting process. I'm using gouache, which is a medium that I have had a lot of problems with. I have done a YouTube video, I think a month ago, talking about how I just give up on gouache, but I felt like, because this painting is so playful and just so kooky, gouache would be such an amazing way of depicting it. Now, in terms of how I approached it, you would have seen that in the background section of this video, I started by watering my paper excessively. And the reason behind this is because I was following a Studio Ghibli tutorial on how they used to create their backgrounds for their movies. And I noticed that their first step is literally dousing the paper in water so that the paint can slip much more easily. And I decided to go forward with that as well because I was creating this gradient on a large scale, and usually with gouache, creating gradients on a large scale is rather difficult. And in all fairness, I think it came out very nicely. I really liked it. I liked it more compared to the technique that you're seeing me use right now, which is pretty much just mixing the water into my pigment and then putting it on bone dry paper. I usually find it very difficult to strike a good balance with the consistency of gouache. Essentially what happens is if you make it too watery, you lose the pigment of it, right? But then if you make it too thick, first off, it's very hard to move it around, but then second off, if you try to put something on top of it, the paint below will reactivate because you have a lot of pigment still in there. It was very much of a back and forth. I think that it was a good reintroduction to gouache after my massive mental breakdown like a month ago, and I had fun with it, although I will say it was challenging and I'm still finding it difficult to cope with the color shift that is so very characteristic of the gouache medium, but we're moving through. Now, in terms of the blending, I think that we have reached a pretty good point in the painting where I can actually show you the resolution that I've reached. Pretty much, the Studio Ghibli method of dousing your paper in water is great if you're working on big gradients, on skies, and whatnot. But obviously here, I could not apply the same thing to the cape because it was already a lot of water in there. It was going to spill everywhere and also reactivate the background. So what I've noticed is the easiest way to get your gouache in a smooth blend is actually mixing up your lightest and your darkest shade, and then maybe 2 or 3 middle shades. But the trick here is actually to put it on a Stay Wet palette. Now you can find these on Amazon. I've got mine on Amazon, but I know that a lot of people DIY it. I will put a tutorial in the description of this video, but it's essentially sort of like an airtight container that has a sponge underneath it that you douse it with water, and then you put sort of like baking sheet. I think that's what it is. It is a wax-based paper, and then you put your pigment on top, and it sort of creates this humid medium that keeps your gouache at a very nice creamy consistency that doesn't reactivate that easily, but also still has a lot of pigment. So it's that really nice sweet spot that allows you to layer things on top of one another while also not lifting the entirety of the pigment that you have created beforehand. In terms of the brush strokes and the brush technique that I'm using, while also obviously using the Stay Wet palette, I decided to go pedal to the metal with having as much of this creamy consistency paint on my paper as possible. And what I'm doing is pretty much I'm putting in my darkest shade and my lightest shade where I think they would be, and then completing that empty space with a big dollops of intermediate shades that I have already pre-mixed. And then you will see right about now that I actually go back, I clean my brush, I put the tiniest amount of water on it, and then I reactivate the paints, and what essentially happens is I'm blending them on the paper because they're still wet. So by using very small, delicate brush strokes, I can manage to mix them on paper in a semi-smooth fashion. Now, a quick heads up on gouache, I'm not a master at it. I'm sure that there are some artists, that can create these beautiful smooth gradients. What the method that I'm using does create a gradient, but it's not really that smooth. If you're looking for complete smoothness, this might not be the greatest place. Gouache might not be your greatest choice, but here are my 2 cents based on what I've learned while working on our little boy, Budi. I would also like to flag that what I am doing after I am sort of okay with the gradients that I've created is that I go back with even more dollops of paint in what I would call like fixing the hues, again because gouache does change its color as it dries. So I'm doing that, as well as going back with a pass of colored pencils, which helps me unify everything and bring out some outlines or some pieces of extreme darkness that I could not manage to capture with gouache, which usually happens again because of the color shift, especially with the whites. So what you see here is literally me just putting back in those highlights and correcting the colors where I don't see them as fit. Overall, I would say I really enjoyed this process. It was really fun to just come up with the idea and play around with gouache again. I hope you like the results, and without any further ado, this is the portrait of our amazing, brave, and extremely cute emperor, little Budi.